Literature and language in general have a relevant role in several of your compositions, through the inspiration or use of text, for example by Rimbaud or Emily Dickinson. In your compositions like Le lieu de la formule, I Lost a World the Other Day, The Spider as an Artist, and Epigram, can you talk about the relationship between your music and the world and your predilection literature, and there is also a strong influence of the visual art or even cinema in your music, as reflected in the title of one of your compositions, which takes the title of the film La Solitude du Corps de Fond, because I found more reference to literature than, for example, visual art or paintings. I don't find.
Okay, so this is a question which is very rich, so it's difficult to respond in a short way. So the idea is that my passion for literature is not, of course, recent, in the sense that I was always fascinated by poetry and literature from a quite young age, actually. But it's true that for a while, when I became a composer, I focused, as an intuition, I would say, I focused on the purely sonic material, let's say. And in a way, without formulating it this way, I, in a certain way, refused any kind of extra musical models. Why? It has been questioned by other people and for myself, of course. The reason, I guess, is that I was always persuaded that I had to find my own voice and my own identity as a composer, solving musical problems with musical solutions. I did not want, I think for maybe more than a decade actually, to have any kind of hybridation with other arts. I don't know if it was valid or not, but as a matter of fact, I thought that it was a kind of unconscious statement, not a conscious statement, really an unconscious statement, that I had to find for myself a sonic identity, which would not necessarily depend on other things. It's true that for the very beginning of my production, I think of pieces like La Conspiration du Silence, or the piece that you just talked about, La Solitude du Corps de Fond. I had some kind of hints from Rothko, from cinema, from things like that. But in general, it did not affect, I must admit, the structure and the formal or the methodology of my writing and so on. It was more kind of inspirations which were appearing in the title, and on some choices. For instance, for La Conspiration du Silence, there was this kind of Rothko a superposition of colors, the color field thing, and it inspired me in a way for a superposition of layers and evolution and matière and so on. But it was very, in a way, intuitive as an influence. I was influenced, but at a purely sensual way, in a way. There was something. I refused to go too far in depth in the influence. That was the thing. So, and later, so it was like that for a while. And then I started to write in 2007 a piece for voice. And then the link between the sound and the literature started, of course, in a classical way, I'm not the first one in this case, to be embodied by the voice. Then the voice became a kind of open door for the link in my let's say, in my sensitivity between the literature and the sound. And then I think it was in 2007, 2008 and so on, I had found my voice and my identity and my sound. So I thought I was allowing myself around 2008, 2009 to introduce some other influences more in depth. And I think this way of introducing literature and poetry especially into my music by the means of the voice really helped me renewing my language. But it's true that from 1999, let's say, to 2007, 2008, I was completely into sound as a kind of inheritor, in a way, for the worst or for the best, of the spectralists, who, if you remember well, introduced the voice very late in their production. Murail, mostly with choir, and Grizet, for instance, and even the other spectralists. So I think I was inheriting, in a way, the musical situation of the spectralists, using a lot of complex sounds or very complex frequential spaces, playing with them. And this project that I had in the beginning, from the beginning, let's say from 1999 2000, until the moment, years and years later, much later, when I started to speak about saturation. But at the moment when I spoke about that, the style was long done. I mean, before this moment of publication of conferences was a kind of conclusion, not a beginning of a style or something like that. That's why I always thought there was too much attention on the verbalization and the speaking, rather than on the music, which was from 2000 with my piece Transmission for bass and electronics. The style is already made, let's say. There is nothing. So of course, after that, you have some variations, and the pieces are not the same, I hope. But there was not, for me, a kind of huge change at the moment when the vocable of saturation came in. No. So the thing is, for the influence of the literature, I guess that yes, the voice was an open door. And when I started to think about it, I realized that I could have a more intimate hybridation between the form or the spirit or the colors, whatever you call them, that happen in poetry and my music, without damaging my identity. I think I had a kind of defensive position between 1999 and 2007, almost considering as a threat to introduce an extra musical model. I was seeing at the Conservatoire many people, I mean, when I was much younger, 2007, much before, when I was 27, 28, 29, I was within the community of composers, as you are, and around me, a lot of people were writing with texts, with extra musical models and so on, and me, I was very cautious. The only pieces I told you about were just the title was a reference and the kind of vibe that I got from the visual arts, something like that, but nothing more. And I think it was a defensive position, really. I thought that introducing another influence would damage a certain kind of integrity of my creative process. It's strange to say so, but I think I decided that because maybe of my education as a musician, a composer is someone who finds musical solutions to musical problems. Yes. That was my idea, let's say. I was not formulating it like that, it was not theory, it was very practical. Anyway, so what happened later is that this open door allowed me to spread poetry a little bit at several layers. For the form, for instance, it happened that in I Lost the World the Other Day, there is no voice, just the title of Dickinson, but the form of the piece is really a kind of tribute to the form of the poem. It's invisible, but it's here, let's say. For The Spider as an Artist in 2014, it's a piece which is clearly making reference, when you look at the piece, with the two needle net, you have this kind of position which reminds you of the spider. And you have many things, actually, and more we go ahead, and especially since 2009, because I wrote this first movement of epigram for voice, there were more and more correspondences and resonances within my music, which happens to affect the orchestration, the melodic lines, the polyphony, some formal things at stake, for instance, switching from texture very quickly to polyphony and go back. It's part of the articulation, the poetry of Dickinson, which really inspired me. So, for instance, in the case of Dickinson, I was fascinated by several aspects of hers. First of all, the poems are very short. In other terms, what happens is that you can easily make a piece which is long and spread the poems in the words of the poem, of course, but you can also have very short form. So I think this kind of reduction and concentration of our inspiration in a few lines, for the poems that I chose at least, allow any composer, not only me, because many composers have been inspired by Emily Dickinson, there is this kind of formal flexibility of our inspiration, which allows the composer to find its way, formally speaking. There is a space, they say, for us. Second, there is a lot of enigmas and ambiguities in our poetry, and also a certain kind of unpredictability when it comes to the formal and also the ambience of a poem. She can change completely from irony to violence all of a sudden, or to nostalgia, to something which is tender. There is a lot of mobility. And I was very inspired by that, because I think it's also, in a way, something that you can perceive in my music, kind of mobility of feelings. Or let's say, once again, I hope so. So, the thing is, I was really fascinated by this aspect of flexibility and formal adaptability, let's say, of the forms of the poem. And, of course, there is also great lyricism in a way, but always mysterious. You never know exactly, and she plays a lot with ambiguities and so on. And me, I'm playing with ambiguities and frontiers between sounds. So I thought that there was something to be done with the poetry. In a very different way, later, but I'm a huge fan of Rimbaud, as you know. And the thing is, I thought that Rimbaud has a particular resonance for me, for one reason. He's not officially the most musical of the poets of French poetry. Verlaine has much more, let's say, he writes songs mostly. Not Rimbaud. Rimbaud is more visual. But the type of images that he develops are very often musical in the references that he makes. For instance, at one point, he speaks about death whistles. Sifflement de mort, and it's something that I use in La Formule when they're whistling and so on. Yeah, and he's full of images like that. And in the meantime, the musicality of his poems is not, especially in the ones that I showed of Illumination, is not too constraining because it's prose mostly, you know. So I think there is another kind of flexibility and also mystery, because in Illumination, even the French, it's still complete mystery. It's a kind of sacred text that you have to interpret. Like, religious experience almost. So, I think in both cases, I chose poets which had some kind of common points in terms of ambiguity in what they're actually saying. They're not telling stories. So the form is up to us, composers, you know. So that's the first big advantage, let's say, when collaborating with them in a way, even if they're dead. And there is this fascination for a multiplicity of interpretations and emotions that are to be interpreted. And it's the same in my music, what I try to do. That this complexity of hybridation, of sounds and so on, would lead to multiple possibilities of interpretation too. Let's say acoustically, musically, of course, and the literature resonates with that. I think the poems that I chose, at least. So I would say that the influence, and that's something that we could say from the beginning, let's say, the influence of literature has been late. Let's say concretely, I came quite late because it took me time to accept to write for voice, knowing that I was mainly focused on sound.
Maybe the first is Lamento? Maybe
Yes,
this is
Lamento.
no?
Yeah,
It's
Lamento
electronic.
is the first piece, which is with voice, with electronics. And later, I decided that even though my music was not coming from the vocal world, that's mostly instrumental and electronic music, and the relationship between the two, I had to face and integrate something which was not necessarily obvious in my initial project, and that's how my music started to change a bit, and I hope to evolve in a positive sense, because I realized that for me, let's say, a music that does not introduce the voice at all, even in a metaphoric way, like Chopin did it. He never wrote for voice, but it's only voice music for the piano. It would lack something. And also a composer always has to, I think, to face what he does not do yet, something like that. I could have continued to write only instrumental music, but I think I would have had the regret. And now I'm writing, precisely now, a piece for mezzo-soprano solo, which is not the easiest piece for me to compose, I must admit. I think voice for me was literally and metaphorically a foreign body initially, compared to my initial project, which is purely coming from more of a post-spectral kind of problematic ambition. And in a way I tried to break the spell of spectral music, in a way, with this saturation thing, because the idea was also to be able to give to the body a renewed role compared to what has been done with this process and this distanciation of process forms and so on, kind of abolishment of the body in a way. And the body comes back. So writing for voice, even for an instrumental composer, was for me very important, because the body has very much an importance as a source of inspiration. The tension of the body produces the sound, is so crucial for the dramatic aspect that I could not avoid having this progressive say, infiltration, yes, of and conquests of the voice over the instrumental music. Now they are always dialoguing, and I think yes, poetry was for me, for those poets that I love, or even now. Not only dead poets, but I am working on the text on the piece of on the text by Céline Minard, with a strong voice she's a strong voice of the new generation of writers. She wrote that text for me, and I think that I came to the point where I could possibly think of the text and the voice and the music and the sound to be really unified, even in a chaotic way, but unified and not separated. I think it was a long process of integration of the influence of the voice, its sensuality also, because when you write for voice, you're writing for a body, and you like a body, and it's a relationship to the flesh and to the sensuality. You know that, of course, yourself, as a composer. So I think that it was really a kind of concretion, I don't know how to say, of something which already exists. Because if you think of the title of my first official piece, it's called L'usage de la parole. And I think that, and I said that in several conferences and master classes, there was this presence of the voice, even invisible. There is no voice, but the voice is a ghost, let's say. And the electronics also is a ghost in my instrumental music. Its influence is there, but of course, you don't hear actual electronics. It's a kind of nostalgia of the electronics, which is not there, and a nostalgia of the voice, which is not there. It's a kind of incantation of the instrumental world in order to call the voice and to call the electronics. So yes, I think it's a seminal relationship between the three, and the voice is, of course, now more and more important to me. And I have projects also for voice. I have projects with Cantando and Mont. I have this piece, of course, and I think it's going to be more and more important because it stimulates my writing and my imagination in a way which is very different of what happened 15 years ago, where I was basically only working with musicians and electronics. I see. So yes, that's the first question. Sorry, I'm a bit long.
Perfect, Franck. I don't think noise can be simplified and reduced to a chaotic category that it's impossible to organize or signify. For example, in my opinion, we can think of noise as another form of color, sensory reality or impression, in the French tradition, for example, of Debussy. Or perhaps noise could be thought of a construction as an artifact or sound device, let's say in the tradition of Ravel. What opinion would you have regarding it? How do you conceive noise in your music, complex sound, inharmonious sound, or however we want to mean it?
Okay. So, there are several ways of responding to the question, and one of them would be first historical, let's say. My conception of the noise and its role and its function inside my music also come from my culture, let's say. It is crucial to understand that my musical pleasure is also linked in my youth and so on, the type of music that I was listening, pop rock, jazz, etc., is linked to a phenomenon that we all know, and for sure it's called electricity. And as Deleuze spoke about affect of wood, of metals and things like that, there is an affect of electricity. This electric world, which completely, of course, we are in since we are born, is something which is providing, I guess, particular effects. And noise is an acoustic, let's say, aspect, let's say, of the sound produced by electricity in a way, in the way that I use it. Of course, noise was existing much before it existed in the nature and so on, but the noise to which I was particularly sensitive as a composer is linked to electricity and to the musical expressions which use electricity. So, once again, I'm not the first one, and there was before, in a way, I'm sure that composers like Varese and later, much later, Romitelli and so on, had that in their ears. But I guess that it's a kind of historically kind of recent phenomenon in the history of humanity. So I think it's still influencing the musical pleasure. I think there is a musical pleasure which cannot, you cannot find an equivalent to this electric pleasure that we might have when we're listening to some music. And we see it even in rock concerts, the people, the way they need to move as a reaction to loudspeakers and electricity. There is something particular here, unique. You know. And I think me as a composer, as a young boy, I was marked by this aspect. So when I was educated as a classical musician, I never forgot those electric sensations that I had in my culture. And I think at one point I needed to integrate all the characteristics of this electric dimension. And I think that's why I started to be more and more seeking more and more for a kind of equivalence. And I think there was one moment which was really crucial for me, 2 or 3 moments, more or less at the same time. First, I discovered in the 90s, I discovered spectral music, which was integrating mixed music, so electricity in a way, and the analysis of the sound in a very new way for my ears, let's say, for someone who had been educated with classical training, I mean, harmony and so on. So for me, this way of processing and integrating what Murray called complex sound, a revolution of complex sound, was already appealing because I was finding a kind of relation, even a central relation with what I hear of pop music, which was my, and jazz, which was my, also a part of my culture, let's say. Even though the spectralists had very few relationship with the jazz, but after all, you have some pieces by Murray which are clearly making reference to Pink Floyd already. Vampire, this is from Italy. Vampire and Random Access Memory is a piece which makes reference to Pink Floyd. So I think I was touched by this kind of very subtle and abstract, it's true, integration of kind of pop listening, you know. Probably would deny it, Murray, but I think there are some pieces of his who are clearly making reference to that. Not for Griset though. And I think that when I started to be very, let's say, into new music, I had a kind of crisis before l'usage de la parole. And because I was envisaging my possible new compositions only with the criteria with which I was educated as a student, harmony, counterpoint, and it was not satisfying. I remember there was something, I was envisaging everything about harmony, but harmony as a coming from nowhere, a little bit, from kind of abstract gift. And I entered the conservatoire in a kind of very difficult moment because I was trying to integrate some sensations. I did not know which ones. And I made a lot of exciting encounters at that point. It was between, let's say, 1998 and 1999, really. First, there was the first practice of electroacoustic music that I did at the Conservatoire, which clearly made me understand that it was possible to make a form and a piece of music without having a functional harmony or a system of harmony which was autonomous. So that was the first kind of discovery. It came first opening of the door, let's say. The second thing was the meeting Helmut Lachenmann when I went to Akant in 1999. Most of the time I was extremely annoyed by him and what he said. No, I was maybe one of the most annoyed. And I think the relationship I have with Lachenmann is very special for one reason. Not as a person, because I met him a few times, but I'm not close to him now. And I've never been a student. But I've always been a little bit kind of irked because I'm always stimulated but not always taken by his music. It's a strange thing. I mean, there are some composers the other way around. If I listen to composers like of the repertoire, like Scriabin does not influence me. As a musician now, but it touches me very much, and I listen to it endlessly. Lachenmann is the other way around. It does make me think a lot, but for my pleasure, I don't know for you, but me, not that much. It's not part of my life. Let's say. If something important happens in my life, if I want to listen to music, it's not Lachenmann that I'm listening. So it's more a kind of thought-provoking catalogue of works that I like to think about. When I met him, he had some kind of thought about the pacing of time, about harmony being a result of this thought about sound and so on. And it was kind of shocking when I met him. So the electroacoustics plus Grisel plus Lachenmann created a kind of real instability in me, and I wrote my trio, L'usage de la parole, which is the first piece that I recognized mine, let's say. Before, I composed a lot, since a long time, but it was more kind of Messiaen Scriabine, a bit Boulez. I was not myself, but everybody knows that, I think. But really, now in retrospect, what I think is that the noise was mostly coming from my electric culture.
I think maybe the idea of the spectral, post-spectral, the inharmonicity.
Yes, absolutely. I was looking for a link, for a way to retrieve the electric culture that I have within the instrumental world. Lachenmann is not in that direction, but after all, as you said, there is a musique concrète instrumental thing, which is not foreign to that, and of course the spectralist. I think the spectralist in Lachenmann was very important because it allowed me to find a way to accept that I would think of my musical discourse in my pieces as not only focused on harmony counterpoint and so on, and my classical culture. So between all my, let's say Lachenmann and Grisel especially were very important, the spectralists, let's say, because they managed to create a link between this electric culture and the purely acoustic instrumental. For me, in my mind, my listening, let's say. And all of a sudden, there was something coherent happening, and I think that's the moment when I found my style as a composer, but not before. Only intuitions before. I remember a nice moment in 1999 or 1999 when Grisel had just died. I was a bit lost, like everybody there. And Marco Stroppa was nominated as a teacher, and I did not know him at the time. And he was very good with me. He looked at my pieces, which were a bit classical compared to what I am, but he had a great intuition. He told me, you should work more on the timbre, because I can hear it knocking at the door. It's a nice way of telling things, right? And he himself, he's very attentioned with sound, with its notation, with the relationship with electronics. So actually, it was I was lucky because of course he was named after Grisel, but I got along well with him, and he was nice with me, and everything went well. But yes, the noise, I think there is something else to say. It's about how to do something with noise and super complex sounds and frequential saturated spaces after Lachenmann and after the spectralist. Several possibilities happen to be proposed to me. For instance, the possibility of doing mixed music. Because the spectralist very few, and Lachenmann not at all, worked with electronics. So that was already something that gave me hope that I could possibly find a way. Also, this way of working only on the sound and the gesture and not trying to make timbre by the means of an harmonic approach, like the spectralist, and not a political approach like Lachenmann. So it was really another way, and later it was named the saturation because there was a link, I guess, with in my head, with a certain kind of the excess of frequencies, I would say, was not used as itself in the spectral music. For instance, when you have a moment which is in a way saturated in Graz, it's the result of a process. We come from harmonicity to inharmonicity and so on. That's the dialogue, the dialectic movement.
What role does improvisation or randomness play in your music? And on the other hand, what is your opinion about free improvisation or free jazz? And if you see connections with your music?
Okay. Maybe I can respond to the second part of the question first. The idea is that I've listened a lot to some free jazz when I was much younger. Cecil Taylor was one of them. Anthony Braxton, very important also. No, thank you. The Art Ensemble of Chicago, and of course later some improvisers that are more recent but less known. And it had a huge impact on me because I think this was the way for me. That's what I was perceiving at the time. I did not know it was named like this, as my new complexity. So it was a kind of crazy thing, and I discovered this music before I would discover Fernet, for instance. So this incredible focus on the intensity of the body in some kind of free and rhythmic information and so on, and hectic. It was something that I perceived first with the jazz, the free jazz scene, let's say. Even though I was listening mostly to recordings, because I was not going to the concert in the suburbs where I was at the time, not near Paris. No, I was not living in Paris, and I was not at 15, 16 years old going in that direction, you know. So, but I listened a lot of recordings, especially Cecil Taylor, and of course, but it's not free jazz, but Charlie Mingus also I was liking very much. So for me, it was part of my culture, this kind of freedom of the gesture. And I think rhythmically, in the rhythmical proposals that I'm finding in my music, there is still about that. But in my music, most of the things are written. It can happen that randomness and improvisation have a special moment in many of my pieces actually, but generally it's in a very specific situation. It is the moment of excess and speed and kind of hectic moment where writing precisely would go against the impression that I want to give. And the impression that I want to give in some very special moments are a kind of liberation of gesture which takes over, let's say, the exactitude. Let's say it's more the globality than the detail. So while writing the exact succession of pitches, if what matters is more the whole texture, the whole timbre, and its energy, it will go again. So it happens that there are some rare moments of randomness in my music, but it only serves one type of musical situation. Otherwise, I never use randomness and improvisation in my music. It's very specific situation linked to speed and the capacity of the musicians to let their body speak rather than the capacity to read music, let's say. Yeah. Also, in some circumstances, the music is so fast that nobody can look at the score and correct. The musician is so fast and so messy. Why writing precisely when you cannot correct precisely so much space and so much information?
In reference to the titles of some of your works, certain concepts are repeated and seem to give an original and unpredictable quality to your compositions. They also seem to create a cycle of pieces. First of all, in my opinion, we have several works that seem to emphasize the idea of electronic that we spoke about, sound such as those titled digital, inatsonic, transmission or procession. Secondly, there is another group of pieces that are very generally associated with jazz or popular music, such as your composition call it swing, charleston, twist, and bossa nova. And as a third group, there are other titles that seem to emphasize a political or social content, such as your works entitled Propaganda, Manifesto, or La Conspiration du Silence. Could you explain to us about this group of works, if they really have connection with each other, and what relationships these titles have in reference to the music?
That's a result of my intuition. I never had, in the beginning, a project of making statements in favor of popular music, in favor of politics or whatever. No, but it came out like ramifications of my mind, of my approach, let's say. So the idea is that it's true. For all the dances title, generally there are pieces where I explore a kind of model which is kind of stereotype, a dance, a little bit vintage, the twist, the charleston, even the bossa nova, and I introduce them within the sound texture in a way which is a kind of super distorted quote, and it gives me the possibility to do in music what is done with the portrait of a kind of Francis Bacon kind of approach, where you recognize the Pope basically, but in the end it's not really a Pope. So I think it's a kind of way of saying I'm using an extra classical music model. I put it in my music, and the model will be recognizable to some rhythms and so on, but it's put so much in a textural context and distortion context or whatever you call it, that there will be an expressive distortion of the model. That's all. I think generally the pieces with the dances title, for instance, are linked to the fact that I used some references to popular music, distorting them so much that there is a rest of them, but also distortion, which create a kind of expressivity that I'm interested in, let's say. About you said something else. It was
yes, for example, the group of composition that
transmission,
the digital procession.
Okay, yeah. I would say that there is another.
I think it's what we spoke about the sound electronic,
actually,
noisy.
yeah. There is this, especially in when it comes to mixed music. Some pieces that are more referential to the more openly, let's say, referential to pop culture, and not only to vintage dances. And but I think once again we can relate with this group of pieces to models coming, or kind of sound of energy coming from rock and things like that, and put into the prism of classical instrumentation, classical instrumentation, or to electronics. So I think there is a kind of perspective which is created for what we would call found objects in a way, but not in a postmodern way. Not by saying, okay, I have that and it's a quote. No, I always create, I hope, a context which is typical enough sonically, in order for us to recognize that there is a flavor, let's say, of jazz, or sometimes very clearly in it, for instance, you have some solo of saxophone and so on. In Propaganda, you have this flavor, in Transmission, of course. But it's a way for me to create a kind of dialectic movement. Once again, not only between noise and harmony, for instance, as I said, but between popular and non-popular, and between classical and pop, And I guess at the time, now I'm not doing that much. But at the time, I think for me, it was a way of creating some contrast and differentiation within a piece, and a way of communicating also. I think of it whilst I'm speaking to you, of communicating in a way which was clearly enough about the distortion of a model. Distortion of a model was very important for me, and a cultural model was interesting, I found, because yes, I would compare to the Francis Bacon portraits. I think for me it was that you have, of course, it's not the thing is not the character itself, but the fact that you recognize a human face, even totally distorted, it's very important to have that.
And for example, for the third group, when it seems for me that there is some political, social reference to propaganda, manifesto, or la conspiration, what you can tell, because you took out the formalist way to approach the music, so sound is sound, I don't know, extra ideas, extra models.
In this case, it's more complicated. Because it's my minor aspect of my catalog, let's say, first. But also because one thing, I don't believe in protest art music in a way, because let's say the amount of people we can touch is not really prompt to create any revolution, I think, unfortunately. So I never believed that my role as a composer would be to make any kind of propaganda in favor of one political idea. But one thing, because of John Lennon can do it, Peter Gabriel can do it, maybe, you too, maybe, but not us. So, but I believe in a kind of revolution of the possible revolution of the listening, and I think it was more in that direction. The idea in La Conspiration du Silence that silence is a threat for sound, and it was mostly the idea of a music which has some difficulty to emerge from silence, always. So it was a part of a kind of struggle, let's say. Propaganda and for the other one, Manifesto. I think there was a real will to create the idea that I would, how to explain that?
Music, a kind of formal music manifest, because the way we hear it
in the kind of in the sense of manifesto. I guess that I was conscious at the time, it was back in 2008 when I did this piece, that there was a kind of manifesto ambience with the saturation thing, and it was a kind of self-irony, saying, okay, we're in that, but in the meantime, so it has a kind of, it's about it's only with winds. So this kind of fanfare, kind of statement was made. Actually, it was. I think the title I found it thinking of the kind of statement that the winds are traditionally sometimes making, kind of a possible group, which is
the most military.
Yes, exactly. And in the meantime, there was an aesthetic irony in the sense, well, in the moment of saturation, that's what I will give my manifesto. So there was a lot of conscious but self-irony inside. I think, yes. And propaganda, I think it was only because it sounded well. Solidly, yes. I never.
That's original. I like it.
No, but I think that a lot of people. I know when it was premiered in France, it was just before the elections. And the journalists of Le Monde come to me. No, not bad. Propaganda just before the elections of the legislative, I think. So it was funny. But I think for me, generally, the political. Apart from La Conspiration du Silence, the political kind of titles were more into this kind of self-irony, which evokes this moment of saturation, which was a kind of statement, let's say, at one point for the conferences, not with the music, but with the conferences. And it was in the air, I would say.
Would you conceive that there are a big diversity and sound materials in your music, crashing each other and producing a fragmentary sensation and a certain formal violence? Or would you rather say the opposite, that everything is harmonized and in balance, obviously in a non-classical way to think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You understand more the...
Yeah. I don't know if I can respond to your question one after another, but I will try to describe what is my formal ambition. I'm coming from this, let's say, this ambition of establishing a continuity after the serial music, which was taken by Ligeti and the Spectralists, let's say. So clearly I'm coming from that, formally. So it's a kind of harmonious, let's say, and fluent way of envisaging the pacing of time, let's say. It's not the moment form, you know. Okay, so from that point of view, it's true that there is a kind of research and elaboration of a phrasing. From that viewpoint, we could call that harmonious and classical. Yeah. In the meantime, I'm more and more fascinated by accidents and unpredictability. So I think from the beginning of my 1999, let's say, to today, the form of my pieces have a tendency to be more and more complex. For instance, a piece like Epigram is much more complex. A piece like Vaillé Failli Beaucaire, or this Le Lieu et la Formule, or Swing even, Swing in 2009. I think I tried to preserve this continuity, and one of the ambitions that I had more and more throughout the years was to introduce more and more accidents so that there would be a perfect balance between this harmonious and fluentness feeling, and in the meantime, if possible, a certain unpredictability. So I would say that I introduce more and more accidents in my music, so that we would get, in the ideal situation, I hope, once again, more and more mystery. Because the process form, for instance, which is an extreme case, okay, of course nobody does that today. But when I was listening to Muraille and Griset, the first pieces, which are some of the best that were made at the time, I was a bit frustrated by this fact that Robert Bresson explains very well when he speaks about cinematograph. He says that in cinema, for the mystery to stay on screen, we have to understand that there is always, we should always let the people guess or trying to guess, and it comes from the fact that the cause comes after the effect, after the consequence. He explains when someone pushes you in the street, you feel it, he bumps into you, you're disturbed, but you don't know why. Is he pursued? Did he steal you? You don't know, and it's only later that you understand. And it's true, it's a fantastic idea, actually, it's genius, that yes, the mystery comes when the cause is given after the effect. So of course, in the case of process form, it's the opposite. It's always the cause is given and after you have the consequence. And I always felt that this way of envisaging form was working and a kind of necessity after the serial predictability, but it was not completely satisfying. And from that point of view, I would say, if I was mean, I would say it's a kind of regression compared to the repertoire. Because when you listen to Berg, for instance, Berg has an incredible sense of transition and continuity, but it's full of surprises inside. And I think this. I come from a generation. I am from a generation who tried to find its way between this process form and some kind of absolutely non-consequential passing of time, I would say. So my feeling is that violent or violence, formally speaking, very clear switch of ambience in terms of color or character. Kind of earthquakes are never so powerful than they were when they are prepared very carefully, meticulously, with a great sense of transition. So to respond to your question, I'm looking for a real balance between this fluentness, horizontality, continuity I was speaking about, and some dates, vertical events and violence and unpredictable articulations, so that in the end you're still completely taken by the plot, musically speaking, but still able to feel that the coherency is always surprising and the surprise is always coherent. And whenever in that sense. So that's my response to your question. It's in between the two. That's the balance which is interesting for me. So,
explain briefly, if you can, how is your formal thinking when you create a composition and you organize its sounds? What kind of strategies do you like to use? Do you work with many sketches and ideas, or do you prefer a more intuitive method? It's a very general question.
Yeah, very general. Let's say, I think it evolved through time because, as I said, when I started to work with mostly texture and timbre and sound back in the 90s, I would start with a sound gesture, I would say, a sound action, including, could be the sound, which was result of a gesture, instrumentally, that would appeal to me, and I would decide that a certain type of gesture and sound will be applied to the whole ensemble, and I would elaborate one morphology which in general turned out to be the beginning of the piece. And then I would, it would be a kind of dialogue between the process form culture that I had, the montage of electroacoustic music, and my own intuitive feeling about what this sound action should become in the future. So it's a very mysterious process, I must say, and I cannot describe it in a quantifiable way. But generally, I was finding my formal way throughout this kind of method, which was partly due to my culture, partly due to my practice of electroacoustic, partly due to my spectral roots, let's say, and of course the material itself, which had to be, which I in a way I was analyzing by the means of pitches, etc., and finding some contrast. It happened that I was drawing some morphologies really in terms of register, thickness, density, activity, all this type of things which are more coming from the electroacoustic stuff. And there were a few sketches to respond to your question. One of the reasons being that when I write, I have a tendency to make some sketches on the score directly, at the pencil, and then to draw on it and to erase and to draw or with ink and so on. So very often there is not so much sketches remaining because they are on the score and they're erased. And I think that more and more the form, I felt that it needed to not come from the sound action itself and its development through time, but also some kind of external logic. And that's why poetry became more and more important to me. It's because the type of energy, envelope, density, activity, all the things that I was describing from instrumental music, this way of analyzing can also be applied to a text. So I think that more and more the external influence that we call a literary model, for instance, in this case, became more and more important to contradict this kind of very intuitive way of approaching the form. Because if I had stayed with this method I was describing at the beginning, I think I would have repeated always the same type of forms without that much accident. And I'm happy that I introduced another type of logic, and I think this is the reason why composers in general introduce extra musical models, whether they are mathematical or poetic or, I don't know, sportive or whatever, not that much, but, you know, or acupuncture as a thing. Because what? It creates a model which counterpoints, I don't know if it makes sense, the purely musical logic. And I needed to have an external logic in order to create some unpredictability in my formal choices. That's the point. So I think now I found a balance in that regard.
Gerard Rizet already commented that he didn't like the spectral concept for his music, that his music was not only reduced to this, was beyond that. What would you say about the concept that usually is assigned to your composition as saturated music? Right now, do you still identify with it? Is it still valid in your style? It is something from the past? What do you think?
Okay, so I think that once again I can come back to the history a little bit of that, because my style was already formed when the vocable saturation happened. I mean, my first significant pieces were back in 1999, 2000, and 9 years later, there was these conferences, including, of course, the works of Yann Robin and Raphael Sendro. But that was the moment of let's say formulation of ideas, and this vocabulary appealed to some people. It appealed to some journalists, to some musicologists, and so on. So from the beginning, I think me and even the others, Yann and Raphael, we were not eager to name that saturation and things like that. Even the little book that I don't have here, about de l'excès du son, it doesn't have the title saturation at all. And why? We speak inside about saturation, but that was a part of the, you know, of the vocabulary. But it played, and people said saturationist and so on. So I think, to respond to your question, there is always a kind of back and forth between the contents and the formulation, and after their publication. And between the moment of the content, the moment of you composing, and the moment of publication of terms and vocabulary, there is a big gap, and you can lose the connection, even as yourself as a composer. I must say that when I composed, even at the time I was never asking myself, oh, are you saturated or not? I fucking don't care. I want my music to work and to provoke emotions, to embody my intuitions and so on. Okay? So, for a composer, and I think it was the case for Grizet, the moment when you're composing is not the moment when you're asking yourself if you're spectral or not spectral, or saturated or not saturated. But as a matter of fact, we're living in a community of people who need to communicate between them. And I think at this point, this word of saturation appealed to some people for several reasons. First, it was giving a kind of pop rock, post-rock color to a new music content. So some people find it an opportunity to
unify.
Yes, but also to promote it in a way which was not really my will, to be honest, because I'm not a Lou Reed or Iggy Pop. Okay, clearly. The second thing was that for me, I liked it in the beginning because it was saturation of colors, like in photography, you know, and a kind of intensity of colors and a super intense thing, and I like this aspect.
The photo that you make in the Salt Club?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And also there is something else, is the idea that saturation was also linked to a certain state of mind of a music which associate these big frequential spaces to a certain aesthetic of excess or an intensity and fast, almost unhuman conception of speed within the human gesture. So there were several things that were appealing. Each person thinking of saturation amongst us were happy more or less with the term, so it came back it came in the conversation and in the books, and in the end, of course, it appealed to people. So, and then I think it was the same for spectral. Grisel says in a text that he was much more in favor of liminal music, liminal, speaking about threshold, but liminal, not very sexy. Some people prefer spectral. So, of course, I find the term to be utterly reductive. But in life, when you're in your 30s, you understand that you cannot control everything. And you're fucked up. No, I mean, no, it's true. I mean, but I was not, or the others, they were not saying, oh, saturation is not the thing, because it was become what? It was becoming a tool of for publication, for identification within the enormous amount of information that we still have for new music. So, I mean, in order to find a name to describe the music, I think it was practical. It's stupid, but it's sadness and it's practical. I don't think that people, when they were speaking about saturation, were thinking it was a very profound concept, but a practical way to describe a certain attitude toward the sound and certain attitude toward the new music culture. And so I got used to it, like I would say a member of the family that you don't really get along well with, but you're obliged to take care of, you know what I mean? So I thought that I was happy that at the time some people used this name, but very quickly I realized that it was only one word. And that it was not honest and not, this is important maybe to say in the interview, that it would have been not honest and not true to continue use this vocabulary whilst my music was evolving quickly about the thing with the thing. So I think this is one point. The moment of publication, kind of photography, the picture that was taken as one point. In terms of vocabulary, I think we should not get more importance. It's also a tool of communication, not for us, but a way of naming something quite complex. So it's reductive, but in the meantime, it's practical and it has a good sense. So I think it's like surrealism. Surrealism, okay, André Breton used it and invented it, or no, it was Apollinaire who invented the term surrealité. Yeah. And after that, it was used by Breton or someone else. But, of course, once you say surrealist, you have very good poet, surrealist, and very bad. So I think that we should be a bit philosophic about that, except that in a world where we're forced to communicate a little bit, some simplifications are very popular. It's practical, but of course it's reductive. I think at one point we have to let go. The only thing it would be great is that people don't stop listening because they have the brand in mind. That's the big danger. How many now saturationist, saturation, it's in the vocabulary almost. Surrealist also, but it says Kafkaïen. Who cares about the contents? That's the sadness. But I think it's the society in which we're living, and also this kind of brand thing, to brand name the thought. Yes. In the meantime, what we have to communicate is quite complex. So when people find a reductive approach which is seductive, they use it as a brand. as a company thing, you know. It's a sadness, but in the meantime, maybe it helped a little bit, making it more accessible for some people, identifiable, you know.
An actualization or new contextualization of melody and harmony, in my opinion, can be found in several of your works. We can hear clear chords working from many perspectives and that contain a certain harmonic sound. Compare it to other compositions that destroy all this to create an informal mass of noise. What can you tell us about these uses in reference to your music or contemporary music in general? Do you think that melody and harmony is still necessary elements from today's music? How we can understand this concept of the past in our present? We don't have it.
So I have one thing to say. The past is not the enemy of the future. In the sense that, yes, the apogee of the concept of harmony, the apogee of concept of melody, belong a bit to the past. And one of the last, let's say, real melodic invention is maybe the beginning of Amérique by Varese, for instance. But after that, it's not something you can sing under your shower in general. No? The great composers are not Lachenmann, even Stockhausen, nothing like that. Don't have that much. Huh? So, you could not imagine a more tricky question. Because what? Because like all the questions that are important, they are not solved yet. They're not answered yet. My feeling is that there is maybe only one piece of mind, and still, la conspiration du silence, which erases more or less harmony and replaces it by clusters of different density and so on. But I quit very quickly this approach, and I reintegrated harmony very quickly. Actually, I think it's already the case for La Solitude du Corps de Fond 2000. There are some pieces that are more chromatic than others, for my string quartet, for instance. But in general, in it, for instance, or swing, there is a lot of harmony, and also in melody in it, and that piece that I'm writing. So yes, I never wanted to quit and to abandon the concept of melody, the concept of harmony, because I don't believe in a modernity which relies on refusal. And I think it's very possible to be radical, if you want, but still have a balanced writing. Stravinsky is super radical, but you have melody, harmony, you have a part of very dense
classical
kind of harmonicity thing. Same thing for Debussy. And you have some kind of... but I thought the Second World War, it's true that you have a lot of composers who are reducing their material and refuse to integrate consonants, refuse to introduce rhythmic, in a kind of quest for purity, in a way. And I don't think that purity is an ideal for me as a composer. Also, there is also something, is that when you're writing only with noise, it seems to me that in terms of purely musical, let's forget the political, bourgeois, anti-bourgeois thing. When you're writing only with noise, very often, for acoustic reasons, I was speaking about that with Stroppa, you are, complex sounds tend to fuse. So very often, if you write only with noise, you have one layer music. Of course, it's very difficult to make a form which is really interesting. And I think that's the reason why Lachenmann reintroduced pitches very quickly. It's because it makes the possibility of perspectives, of spaces that are different, of superpositions and so on. And also the spectralists, they never abandoned, even though some of them were. So I think that when I hear pieces that are only relying on noise, avoiding many other dimensions of the expressive arsenal that we have, I'm a bit disturbed, and that's why I never quit. And I think it became very quickly one of the first things at stake in my music. That's why the question is very accurate. It's this mix. It's not putting together pitches and noises, but create relationship between them, or mask effects, or let's say orchestration of pitches by noise, or noise by pitches, and degree of saturation, degree of grain, degree of transparency in a chord. That's not that you have a few moments in my music that are purely harmonic and purely noise, but it's very rare that it stays stable, because I'm looking for a dramatic and dynamic sense of musical discourse. That's why. So yes, this is one of the central parts of my music, how to articulate pitches and noise in a way which is not spectral, not musique concrète instrumentale, but proceed of a kind of listening which is non-systematic and integrates, let's say, the sensation that you can have with electroacoustic music in a very flexible way, that you have with all these influences, but in a way which is not unilateral, in a way, I would say, or with one function. So I think it was one of the things for me, and less maybe for the others, for Sendo or even Jan. I think that I try always to create some kind of dialectic movement between texture and polyphony, melody and noise, harmony and, for instance, la solitude du coureur de fond. It's a kind of good example, because it's a piece made of multiphonics, so it's always more or less the noise is never far, but the harmony is always present. And I wanted to make a mix, and I think to invent, or I don't know, to propose, let's say, invent, I don't know, but propose a real inner counterpoint inside even a melody, where you are always going from noise to pitch, both together, and degree of the palette of differentiation is very large, I would say. It's like really, when you look at a painting, you have a certain amount of density of material and concreteness, or transparency of pastel almost, kind of, and I was looking for this kind of very visual and flexibility and exchange of ambiguities. For me, this is the dialectic movement I want for my music, even in a melody. So it's a way of proposing melodies and harmonies that are integrating the noise as possibly a poison, possibly a kind of light, a threat, whatever. There is in this mixture a real quest for a stability that never comes, which you fail to obtain. And I like very much this idea. And I think this is, if you want to speak about my music within the saturated music field, I think, I don't want to say stupid things, but I don't think we can find that in Raphael and in Jan. Yeah, I don't think so. Should ask them, but I don't think so. And yes, that's part of my particular, and this sentence of my colleague from Berkeley is very fair, very clever. I never thought we had this, not as a consensus, but as a kind of way of establishing a back and forth which is permanent, and create this dynamism between noise and where each time you have a melody that appears, it's the promise, that it's going to be destroyed and go back and drawn back into the texture. When you have a texture, that there is promise of a melody, of an harmony coming out of it. And I think it's a part of the pacing of time is articulated and rhythmed by these exchanges permanently, these ambiguities permanently.